What if I told you that everything the media is saying about Israel and Iran is a distraction? Not a lie, exactly. But not the whole truth either. Because while every news anchor is debating airstrikes and nuclear facilities and red lines, Israel is playing a completely different game, a longer game, a colder game, and almost nobody is talking about it. So today, we're going to pull back the curtain. We're going to follow the real money, the real strategy, and the real goal, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Let's get into it. Okay, so on the surface, the story sounds simple enough. Israel hates Iran. Iran hates Israel. They've been at each other's throats for decades. Iran funds groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, calls for Israel's destruction, develops missiles that can reach Tel Aviv, and most terrifying of all, has been quietly, carefully, persistently building toward a nuclear weapons capability. And Israel says, we will never let that happen. Never. So when you see Israeli jets flying, when you hear about covert assassinations of Iranian scientists, when explosions happen at Iranian military facilities in the middle of the night, the media packages it neatly. Israel strikes Iran to stop the nuclear program. Clean headline. Easy to understand. Move on. But here's the problem with that story. If stopping the nuclear program was truly Israel's only goal, they've had dozens of opportunities over the past 30 years. Dozens. And yet, Iran's nuclear program is more advanced today than it has ever been. So either Israel has been failing spectacularly at this one job for 3 decades, or stopping the nuclear program was never really the end game. Which one do you think is more likely? To understand what Israel actually wants, you need to rewind, way back. Not to 2024, not even to 2003. You need to go back to 1979. Before 1979, Iran and Israel were not enemies. That sounds crazy today, but it's true. Under the Shah, the king of Iran, backed by the United States, Iran and Israel had a quiet, almost friendly relationship. They traded, they shared intelligence. Iranian oil flowed to Israel. Israeli technology went to Iran. They were not allies publicly, but privately. They were working together against common enemies in the Arab world. Then came the Islamic Revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini overthrew the Shah, declared Iran an Islamic republic, and almost overnight reframed the entire Iranian national identity around one central enemy, Israel, the Zionist entity, as they called it. Not just a political rival, an ideological enemy, a religious enemy. Israel was written into the bones of the new Iranian state as something that must be destroyed. And that changed everything, because suddenly, Israel didn't just have a neighbor that disagreed with it. Israel had a neighbor whose entire political system was built on hating it. A neighbor with oil money, a large population, and ambitions to lead the entire Muslim world as its revolutionary vanguard. That is an existential threat of an entirely different category. Now here's where the chess game starts getting interesting. Iran in 1979 wasn't powerful enough to directly threaten Israel. They had internal chaos, a revolution, then immediately an 8-year war with Iraq that bled them dry. But Khomeini had a vision. If you can't punch Israel directly, you build a network of fists around it. Hezbollah in Lebanon, created in the early 1980s with direct Iranian support. Hamas in Gaza, backed, funded, trained by Iran. Islamic Jihad in the West Bank. The Houthis in Yemen, militia networks in Iraq and Syria. Iran didn't just build proxy forces. It built what Iran calls the axis of resistance. A ring of armed groups surrounding Israel from multiple directions. North, south, east, west, like a slow tightening noose. Military strategists call this a multi-front encirclement strategy. Think of it like this. Imagine you're in a neighborhood and one of your rivals can't fight you himself. So instead, he quietly moves aggressive guys into houses on every side of your street. Your north, your south, your east, your west. Each one of them picks small fights, throws rocks, keeps you nervous. The cost of keeping your neighborhood safe goes through the roof. You're constantly looking over your shoulder. And your rival, he just sits back and watches you get exhausted. That has been Iran's strategy toward Israel for 40 years, and it has worked, partly. Now pay close attention to this next move, because this is where the real Israeli goal starts to come into focus. For years, Israel's strategy was containment. Knock back Hezbollah here, bomb a Hamas tunnel there, strike a Syrian weapons convoy, play whack-a-mole with the proxies, try to prevent any one piece of Iran's network from becoming too powerful. But October 7th, 2023 changed the calculation completely. When Hamas launched its attack, killing over 1,200 Israelis, taking over 200 hostages, it wasn't just a military shock. It was a psychological earthquake. The Israeli intelligence apparatus, arguably one of the best in the world, failed to see it coming. And suddenly, the question wasn't just, how do we respond to Hamas? The question was, if the proxy network is this dangerous, what happens in 5 years when Iran has a nuclear weapon? Because here's the terrifying math that every Israeli strategist was running in their head after October 7th. Iran's proxies, without a nuclear umbrella, killed 1,200 Israelis and paralyzed the country for months. Iran's proxies with a nuclear umbrella protecting them would be untouchable. Completely untouchable. Because you can't massively retaliate against Hezbollah if Hezbollah's patron has nuclear weapons pointed at your cities. The nuclear weapon doesn't have to be used. It just has to exist. And the moment it exists, the entire balance shifts. That's the real threat. That's what keeps Israeli decision-makers awake at night. Not one airstrike, not one nuclear facility, the whole system. So here's what Israel's real goal looks like when you strip away all the media noise. Israel doesn't just want to delay Iran's nuclear program, it wants to fundamentally dismantle Iran's ability to project power across the entire Middle East. The nuclear program, the missile program, the proxy network, the financial pipelines that fund all of it. This isn't a defensive strategy anymore. This is a reordering strategy, and the signs are everywhere if you know what to look for. Let's start with the proxy network, because that's actually what Israel hit first and hardest after October 7th, not Iran's nuclear facilities. In the space of roughly 12 months, Israel did something that most military analysts considered impossible. It systematically degraded Hezbollah, the most powerful non-state military force on the planet, to a shell of itself, killed its top commanders, including Hassan Nasrallah, the leader who had run Hezbollah for over 30 years, destroyed huge stockpiles of its weapons, disrupted its command structure to the point where the organization could barely coordinate. Then Hamas leadership, much of it killed or in hiding. Then Syria fell, not directly because of Israel, but Israel took massive advantage of Assad's collapse bombing hundreds of Syrian military sites to ensure that Iran could no longer use Syria as a land corridor to supply Hezbollah in Lebanon. One by one, the links in Iran's axis of resistance chain were being cut. But here's the crazy part the media mostly ignored. Each of these operations wasn't just tactical, they were architectural. Israel wasn't just punching Iran's proxies, it was systematically dismantling the entire infrastructure of Iranian influence in the Arab world. The supply routes, the weapons caches, the communication networks, the command and control centers. Iran's 40-year project, the Ring of Fists around Israel, was being unwound in 12 months. Now, the nuclear question. Most people think Israel's problem with Iran's nuclear program is simple. Iran builds a bomb, Iran uses it on Israel. But the actual strategic nightmare is more subtle than that, and more dangerous. Iran doesn't need to use a nuclear weapon to win. It just needs to have one. Think about North Korea. North Korea has nuclear weapons. Is North Korea constantly at war? No. In fact, North Korea is completely untouchable. Nobody invades North Korea. Nobody seriously threatens regime change in North Korea. The nuclear weapon is not a sword. It's a shield. The most impenetrable shield a country can have. Now apply that logic to Iran. And Iran with nuclear weapons could dramatically escalate its support for Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, all of its proxies, and dare anyone to stop them, because any significant retaliation risks nuclear escalation. The proxies become truly untouchable. The encirclement strategy reaches its final, permanent form. Israel's existence as a state, not just its comfort, but its actual existence, becomes dependent on the goodwill of a country whose government has been calling for its destruction since 1979. That is not a risk any Israeli government can accept. That is not even a debate in Israel. Across the political spectrum, left, right, secular, religious, there is one point of absolute consensus. Iran cannot have nuclear weapons. Full stop. So the airstrikes on nuclear facilities are real, and they matter, but they're one piece of a larger picture. Here's the move that almost nobody is connecting. The real Israeli strategic vision, and this is not conspiracy theory, this is what you find when you read what Israeli military and intelligence figures actually say is regime change in Iran, not military invasion. Israel doesn't want to occupy Iran. That would be insane. Iran has 88 million people, massive geography, and one of the oldest and most proud civilizations on Earth. No military force is conquering and occupying Iran. But there's another kind of regime change, the kind that comes from within. Iran is not a stable country. Let's be very clear about that. The Islamic Republic sits on top of enormous internal contradictions. A large, young, educated, largely secular urban population that is profoundly frustrated with the regime. Massive economic misery caused partly by sanctions, partly by corruption, partly by the regime's chronic mismanagement. A currency that has lost most of its value. Unemployment that hits young people hardest. And a government that responds to any protest by shooting people in the streets. In 2009, the Green Movement nearly cracked the regime open. In 2019, massive economic protests spread across dozens of Iranian cities. In 2022, Mahsa Amini's death triggered the Woman, Life, Freedom uprising. One of the most sustained protest movements in Iranian history, with women burning their headscarves in the streets and crowds chanting, "Death to the dictator." The regime survived each of these, but barely. And each time it had to use extreme violence to do it. Now here's Israel's calculation, and this is cold, and it's strategic, and it's worth understanding. If Iran's proxy network is dismantled, the regime loses the prestige and the narrative that has justified its authoritarian control for decades. The regime's entire identity is built around resistance to America and Israel, around being the revolutionary vanguard of the Muslim world, around the idea that all the economic suffering is worth it because Iran is fighting the great fight against the oppressor. But if Hezbollah is crippled, if Hamas is weakened, if Syria is lost, if the Houthis are being degraded, if Iran's missiles get shot down by Israeli defenses, then what exactly has 40 years of sacrifice and sanctions achieved? What does Iran have to show for it? The regime's legitimacy is built on the proxy network's success. Destroy the network, and you attack the regime's very reason for existing. This is where it gets truly geopolitical. Israel isn't just trying to make Iran less dangerous. Israel is trying to create the conditions under which the Iranian regime collapses under the weight of its own failures, not a military invasion, an implosion. But here's the part where the media completely loses the thread. This is not an Israeli plan operating in a vacuum. This is Israel acting as the forward element of a much larger realignment, one that involves the United States, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states. Yes, Saudi Arabia, the country that for decades defined itself partly through hostility to Israel, the country that has always demanded Palestinian statehood as a precondition for any normalization, the country that is the self-appointed leader of Sunni Islam. Saudi Arabia and Israel have been quietly moving toward a de facto alliance, not because they suddenly love each other, but because they share one massive common enemy, Iran. Shia Iran's rise in the Middle East has terrified the Sunni Gulf monarchies for decades. Iran backed militias that destabilized Bahrain. Iran-backed Houthis fired missiles at Saudi cities. Iran's influence expanded through Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, a Shia crescent stretching from Tehran to the Mediterranean. For Saudi Arabia, Iran is not a distant ideological rival. Iran is an existential competitor for dominance of the Middle East. So when you see Israel dismantling the axis of resistance, Saudi Arabia is not weeping. Gulf states like the UAE are not sending condolences. Quietly, very quietly, they are watching and calculating, and in some cases facilitating, intelligence sharing, airspace, logistical support. The Abraham Accords of 2020 weren't just a feel-good peace deal. They were the public face of a strategic realignment that had been building for years. This is the real architecture of what's happening in the Middle East right now. Not Israel versus Iran in isolation. A grand coalition, some of it public, most of it secret, oriented around containing and ultimately collapsing Iranian power. Now, most people watching the news think this is about nuclear bombs and missile strikes and red lines, but it's actually about who controls the Middle East for the next 50 years. Because here's what a post-Iranian power Middle East looks like from the perspective of everyone in this coalition. Saudi Arabia can build its Vision 2030 economic transformation without constantly worrying about Iranian-backed destabilization. The Gulf monarchies can invest in their own futures without the permanent shadow of the Shia militia threat. Israel can exist without the permanent encirclement strategy. And the United States can reduce its military footprint in the region because the local powers have stabilized the security order themselves. That's the vision. Whether you think it's right or wrong, whether you think it's realistic or a fantasy, that is the actual strategic vision driving Israel's actions right now. Every airstrike, every assassination, every diplomatic maneuver, it all connects back to this larger architecture. If you want to understand real global politics without the noise and the spin and the oversimplified cable news takes, make sure you subscribe. Because this is exactly the kind of analysis we do here, connecting the dots that the headlines miss. Now, is this going to work? That's the honest question. And the honest answer is, nobody knows. And there are serious reasons to be skeptical. Iran is not a weak state. It has survived 40-plus years of sanctions, wars, isolation, and internal crises. The regime has proven remarkably resilient, partly through repression, partly through genuine nationalist sentiment that even Iranians who hate the regime can feel when they believe their country is under foreign attack. Nothing unites population like being bombed. The nuclear program is dispersed, hardened, buried deep underground. Destroying it fully would require sustained military campaign of a scale that Israel alone probably cannot achieve, and that the United States, at least publicly, has not fully committed to. And the proxy network, while significantly degraded, is not dead. Hezbollah is weakened, but it still exists. The Houthis are still firing missiles. Iran is still funding and training new generations of militants. These networks have been built over 40 years. They won't disappear in 1 or 2. There's also the question of what comes after. Even if the Islamic Republic eventually collapsed under economic pressure and internal revolt, what replaces it? Iran's last experiment in revolution didn't exactly produce a liberal democracy. Revolutions are chaotic. Power vacuums are dangerous. An Iran in chaos with nuclear facilities and weapons stockpiles is its own category of nightmare. The Israeli strategists know this. They're making a bet, a calculated, high-stakes bet that the alternative, a stable, nuclear-armed, proxy-empowered Iran, is worse than the chaos of a destabilized one. Whether history judges that bet as wisdom or catastrophic miscalculation, we'll find out. Here's what I want you to take away from all of this. The next time you see a headline about Israel and Iran, an airstrike, a diplomatic crisis, a nuclear negotiation, a proxy attack, don't read it in isolation. Read it as one move in a much longer game. Ask yourself, who benefits from this move? How does it fit into the larger strategic picture? What is each side trying to build? Not just today, but in 10 years, in 20 years. Because the Middle East is not a collection of separate crises. It is one continuous chess game, with decades of history behind every single move. Israel's real goal in Iran isn't stopping one nuclear facility. It's reshaping the entire regional order, dismantling Iran's power projection, isolating the regime, and creating the conditions under which the Islamic Republic becomes unsustainable. Whether that works is the question that will define the next chapter of world history. And the scariest part of all, Iran knows exactly what Israel is trying to do, and it's preparing its own next move right now. So the question isn't whether this ends. The question is what it looks like when it does. Think about that.